Hello again, gang. KR King here, as always, at your service to help you homebrew your own D&D campaign. You know, one of my earliest videos was on making dungeons, and I gave a list of 10 dungeon types to consider when creating a homebrew dungeon. And I did 10 types in under 20 minutes, which means it was just kind of a sample of each of these types. You know, and in fact, in my introduction, I gave some storyline and game mechanic ideas for each of these in like under a minute. So obviously there's a lot more material here to unpack in terms of, dungeon mechanics, usage, and creation. So with that in mind, this is the first in a series in which I'm going to look, closer detail at each of the 10 types of dungeons that I outlined. And I'm going to start with one of my very favorites, the Lost Dungeon. And the reason I love this style of dungeon so much is usually when the player characters, unseal or enter a lost dungeons, they're the first ones in a very long time to travel through its dust-choked hallways. They are first in line for this lost dungeon's treasures, but more importantly, they're first in line for its horrors. All right, so an interesting facet of the Lost Dungeon concept is that this refers to its status in the present day, not its function when it was constructed. And when we look at the list of dungeon types that I gave in that earlier video, we can see that any of these types could become a lost dungeon. So is it a haunted dungeon, a working dungeon, a lair dungeon, a cavern, a gateway dungeon, a prison dungeon, an underwater dungeon, a mine, or a legendary mega dungeon? Now you might ask, well, wait a minute, a working dungeon, how can that be a lost dungeon? Doesn't it imply that it no longer functions? Well, here's the thing. If a lost dungeon had been constructed as a prison, and somehow the entrances become sealed, but you have, the prisoners held in some kind of stasis and guarded by constructs, it could, in fact, still be working as a prison dungeon. With a lair, we think, well, whatever lives there must have an exit such that they can go out and feed. But think of a dragon lair in a volcano, and there's some kind of long sealed back entrance to this lair. So it's important to think about the original purpose of a dungeon and then how that relates to the, how and why that it became lost. And both that how and why can be related to that purpose or be indirect. So first I would divide that how and why in terms of an internal or external cause. Typically, an internal cause for the how and why of a dungeon being lost means that there was some group or entity there and they either abandoned the dungeon and sealed it off, or they took some action that resulted in being sealed and then lost. But it could be some conflict that this internal group got into with an external force or entity or power or whatever that caused them to either abandon the dungeon or be sealed within. And if they abandoned the dungeon for whatever reason, maybe they sealed it off so that they could return to it, and for whatever reason they never came back, and now it's been lost, these entrances to the ravages of time. So a lost tomb may have been sealed up such that it prevented looting from grave robbers. A lost temple might be the result of some kind of religious rite gone wrong. The lost entrance to a lair might be the creature that lives there, say the red dragon in a volcano, there's this back entrance, this old dungeon, and they sealed it up. A gateway dungeon may have been abandoned by those using the gateway. They went to the other side, wherever that goes, but first they sealed up the entrances. A mine may have been sealed by the miners to protect, the treasure inside. They were going to come back later, and they never did. As I mentioned in an earlier video on adding horror to your videos, a fanatical cult may have sealed themselves inside a temple or some sort of cavern, by their crazed leader waiting for Judgment Day. And then you have an external cause, which is some force or a calamity which seals off a dungeon and renders it lost. So an underwater dungeon becomes one and hence lost if it's caused by some, earthquake or a tsunami or something in which the water level rises and floods this dungeon. A gateway dungeon may have been sealed up because those using it didn't have the power to destroy the gate, but they didn't want anyone coming in or out. The prisoners of a prison dungeon may have escaped, and they trapped their jailers inside and, caused cave-ins or whatever to, give them a taste of being held. And of course, these prisoners, after their escape, they went outside and they eliminated all traces of the entrances. I've talked about plagues in other videos. This is a classic historical reason for structures or areas to be abandoned, neglected, and eventually forgotten. The thing about the world of D&D is you have magical plagues, perhaps something that's come through some gateway dungeon that caused everyone to leave, or through some failed magic rite. As always, a mine has the potential of the miners digging too deep, a la the Balrog in the Mines of Moria. Releases this, they try to escape, and then this action causes a cave-in. And notice how the lines are blurred between internal and external forces when you have something like miners going too deep and causing some external force to rise up and destroy the dungeon. All right, so we've seen how the original purpose of a dungeon can be a major factor in why it was lost, but it could also be an incidental cause. Unless the actions of a group cause some natural disaster, an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, it's just bad luck. And an abandoned dungeon without sealed entrances may become sealed over time, just the weathering, of the atmosphere, rock slides, this sort of thing. Think of the tombs of ancient Egypt. People knew their locations, for hundreds of years, but slowly but surely the deserts, overwhelmed them and people died and they were forgotten. Now, in real life, the pyramids could never be covered, the Sphinx only up to its head emerging from the sand, but in the world of D&D, you could have a pyramid or a huge structure like the Sphinx that gets covered over time by the shifting sands. And that pyramid could have all sorts of chambers and hallways and pits and whatnot. A magical conflagration that has no connection to the dungeon but appeared nearby might cause the entrances to collapse or make the hallways unusable, unlivable, and then abandoned, and then over time those entrances become lost. Cave complexes are often lost to landslides because they are on mountainsides, and this has happened over the years. Many of the caves in France that have famous Stone Age wall paintings were covered by landslide and then rediscovered many years later. So you've determined the how and why of a dungeon being lost, and you're taking into consideration its usage, when it was an active dungeon, if this has any relation to that, if there's some incidental cause, the why and when it happened. The next question is, why was it found? What has happened that now there's an entrance that is open or some information has come to light such that it can be tracked, to its location and somehow an entrance be dug out? Or is there some means to enter magically? And here again, this can be an external or internal force. If a natural earthquake or landslide sealed a dungeon or cavern, could another one unseal it? As I mentioned, this was the case with many of those ancient Stone Age cave drawings. The entrances were unsealed by landslides. There was a little opening and someone dug out the rest of the entrance and they were rediscovered. You could have an accidental external force. So the city of Pompeii, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, was forgotten about for hundreds of years. And then someone digging an aqueduct in the 16th century stumbled upon a wall. The city of Herculaneum, which was buried in the same eruption, was discovered much later, like 200 years later, someone building the foundation for a palace. An external force could be some tome or parchment which describes the location of this lost dungeon, providing a map to which a party, the player characters, might return and figure out a way to unseal the entrances. You could have the intervention of a deity that provides information to its acolytes as to this location of this lost dungeon for purposes only known to itself. Could be a newly discovered teleport, Dias sigil or gate that sends one into a long sealed dungeon. The trick, of course, there is you better hope it's a two-way teleport. A creature which naturally digs through the ground, let's say an Umber Hulk, might break through in some sealed dungeon passage and then continue out and go up above ground for prey. The water level at the site of an underwater dungeon may lower for natural or magical purposes and reveal the entrance once again to the land above the water. But there can also be internal forces that open up long sealed entrances to a lost dungeon. If you have an area with thermal activity, you could have steam vents that push open some areas, or you see the steam rising from the ground. A volcanic eruption could result in lava tunnels that, once they cool down, may lead to the passages of a lost dungeon. A prison dungeon which holds creatures in a stasis might lose its magical efficacy and the creature is suddenly freed and it has the ability to dig its way out. A gateway dungeon might be rediscovered on the other plane. Creatures come through, go into this dungeon, and they too might have the ability to dig their way out. If you have a lair, let's say the dragon that I mentioned in the volcano, it might come along and open up this long sealed entrance, maybe even just accidentally. Another really important potential internal source is if you have a haunted dungeon. And there's an important point of order here. Any of the other dungeon types that I mentioned could be haunted, and a lost dungeon has that extra appeal since oftentimes things are trapped inside and they're bitter and their spirits, haunt the dungeon. And of course, tomb, by its very nature, we think of as haunted. The point here is those entities or creatures which are haunting a long sealed dungeon somehow gain this power to free themselves, whether it's a nearby magical conflagration, the usage of some device, or perhaps the rites performed by an evil cult that gives them the power to do this. So all of these reasons for a dungeon becoming, unsealed or discovered from whether it's an external or internal force answer one side of a D&D game mechanic, which is why does this happen in the here and now? And what is the other side of that here and now? The player characters. So the next question is, how do the player characters find out about this once lost dungeon? So the simplest reason is the players are just going along and they stumble upon a hole in the ground or some mine shaft that's recently become uncovered. Now the thing about the stumbling upon the long sealed dungeon is it's a pretty lazy GM device. Maybe if you want a very quick adventure hook, you're running a one shot or something, I don't know, you could use this, but it's a little boring. One way to mix up the stumble upon trope is to create a sealed gate or doorway or something in an existing dungeon, and the players have to find something or go somewhere else to get some item, and then they can unseal it. You could use the super game mechanic-y thing like in the Dungeon of the Mad Mage where you have to be a certain level to pass through this gate. I tend not to like that. It's a little contrived, but you could use it. But as I say, having the players discover an entrance to a long lost dungeon without any effort is boring. So how do you determine the how and why of the players discovering either an entrance to a lost dungeon or the existence of one? One thing to consider, as always, is the original purpose of the dungeon, but another is how long has it been since the dungeon was lost. So you might think that, it's a very long time for any dungeon to become lost, but that's more a dungeon that's been totally forgotten. There might have been a very celebrated mine that has collapsed within living memory, but because of the shift in the ground and there's landslides or earthquake activity, the entrance area has been lost. You've got people searching this area for this lost mine, but it might be a very dangerous area. Some creature may have moved in nearby that doesn't like people poking around. Think about treasure hoaxes in the real world. With Oak Island, we know exactly where that island is. The problem is people that have tried to dig there, the seawater rushes in, there's gases and whatnot, and there's probably no treasure. Then you have a celebrated mine, Victoria Peak in New Mexico, where someone stumbled out of the wilderness or whatever and said, I discovered this incredible mine, but they can never quite find the entrance again. But in D&D, these places are real, and the players can stumble across some bit of information. A tome, an individual who has something, a parchment, a mural on a wall, something that gives them the information about some celebrated lost dungeon. With planar distortions, you could have a dungeon that just disappears one day, whether it's last week or 50 years or 500 years ago. What the players have to figure out is what is the key to unlock this planar distortion and bring back the dungeon. The thing about having a very long time go by in terms of a dungeon being lost and hence forgotten, such that all traces of it above ground are gone, is that the only things, if it's still sealed, still inside would be ghosts, undead, constructs, and creatures somehow kept magically alive. Now, notice that's quite a list. There could be local legends that talk of this mythical lost dungeon, but there might be nothing at all until something unseals it. Think of the various reasons that I gave earlier of how dungeons are rediscovered. then you have that happen when the players are in, nearby proximity. And again, is that just random chance, or are the players lured there by some information? Or do the players, through their actions, cause a lost dungeon to emerge? And this is what makes the stumble upon, coincidental discovery of a lost dungeon unsatisfying. You want to have player agency cause things to happen in your world. So when you're thinking about the how and why of a dungeon becoming lost, you want to figure out some clues, some things in your world that might lead the players to make some good informed decisions and then rediscover the dungeon. Or you want to create scenarios through which the players, consciously or not, could do actions that open up a long sealed dungeon. And this leads to one more option that you can do, in which the players find themselves inside a long sealed dungeon complex. Now, typically this happens because they are sent there by some powerful creature or force, or they go through a teleport gate or sigil or something that just takes them there. Now, I've done this in the past, and the thing is, if you're going to send players into a sealed area, you need to make, there is a way to come back. Because you don't want to kill your campaign or, an outright deus ex machina to lift them out. And it shouldn't be an arbitrary thing. The players have made a conscious choice. Either they did something to a powerful creature, or they made the decision, we're going to get on the teleport gate. So there are some ideas on creating your own lost dungeon. Think of the how and why that a dungeon became lost, either related to its original purpose or its location. Decide how it becomes unsealed and what role, if any, the players have in that unsealing, and then you're done. Oh wait, you still have to create the dungeon, which might be another video. But until then, if you like my content, please subscribe, please leave some comments, and most importantly, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.